Welcome back to the Waismann Method Podcast. I'm your co-host, Dwight Hurst. I'm joined as always today by Clare Waismann, founder of the Waismann Method. We're also really lucky today to have Dr. David Livingston, who is the hospital psychotherapist, here as well. Clare and David are going to help to answer some really important questions. One of the issues that actually comes up a lot in the world of treatment for opiate dependence and any real issues that have to do with addictive behaviors is the term recovery itself. Am I able to recover from addiction? Am I ever truly recovered? Or do I spend my life in recovery, as many people might say? We're going to talk about some of that terminology, what's useful about it, what might be problematic about it. Clare and David are here to offer some really good insights into that, and also to help us sort of sort out what really is addiction. What do we mean when we say that? And as far as getting started in that conversation, well, there's really no time like the present.
Hi, Dwight. David Livingston here.
Hi, David.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. I won't make the Dr. Livingston, I presume, joke. So I figured that people have probably already done that, right?
Yes. Quite all right.
Today we're talking about really the term and the concept of being in recovery or versus recovering, right, from addiction. Am I saying that in a good way, Clare?
Right.
As far as those two contrasting ideas, or
absolutely, that's perfectly said.
It's become such a different concept in and of itself, recovery versus being in recovery. Correct. What have those definitions become, and what's useful or problematic about them?
I think because it takes such an effort and such strength to get through treatment and achieve sobriety. Having people saying that they are in recovery endlessly, I think some way somehow makes them feel a bit hopeless. Like they have not achieved full success. When I search the term being in recovery, I see a lot of definitions making progress, even though he or she is not cured. Sometimes used as being in remission. It's an unfair description for somebody that have overcome an issue. So, as much as they can be, fragile to that issue, the same as if you had an injury at one point and, you're aware of that part of your body that can get re-injured, I think it's okay to say you recovered.
Yeah, it seems like the old school thinking is that there's a fear that if I say I'm recovered, then I'm going to let my guard down and start drinking again or start using drugs again.
I think that's called awareness, responsibility. I mean, you can call a million other things, but because some people, did not do their due diligence to maintain a healthy life, regardless if there was drugs, alcohol, obesity, whatever it is. It doesn't mean everybody that has succeeded cannot get the, reward of being considered a success.
Yeah. And that's a focus that I am learning more about from you as you've been talking about this focus on healthy lifestyle. It's the idea of a healthy lifestyle as applied to addiction. One of the things that's very consistent with the medical model is you're applying that the same way you do to any other medical problem. And it does seem like that's where a lot of problems can come from, is splintering away from the idea that addiction is a medical situation and going more towards it being its own sort of, I don't know what to call it, almost this quasi-magical thing that exists in its own world. And I think a lot of your focus is pulling that back in and saying, no, this is a medical situation. It's a medical problem to treat.
I think addiction is actually a consequence of a physiological condition that was not treated. So addiction is a behavioral issue, but it is a consequence and is not the root of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So we see it as if it is a mental health issue, if it is a physical issue that caused pain, regardless if it was emotional or physical. If it got treated, effectively and appropriately at the right time in the beginning, then addiction would probably be not an issue. But allowing the pain and allowing the dependence of whatever the person is using to mask that pain to grow leads people to addiction behaviors in order to acquire the substance, in order to use the substance and all the things that comes, with it.
When you talk about that concept of recovering from addiction, I think that's one of the first things people think about is, can you recover from addiction? And how can you tell where you're at in that, if you are recovering or recovered?
Well, I think if you're living a productive life, a healthy life, you recovered. Can you relapse? Of course you can relapse, but you can relapse on anything in life, anything. Right. Bad behaviors, substance abuse. It doesn't matter what it is. I think we all have to do our due diligence every day when we wake up to live a productive, healthy life. So getting people with, that has suffered from addiction and putting them in this box as this group is uncurable. This group are always going to have this issue. This group will never fully recovered. I think is unfair. I think it's cruel more than unfair. Addiction is a condition, and I think we look at it. We give a life of its own.
So, well, and the phrase that popped in my head just then when you said that was a life sentence. Like I'm sentenced to always have something.
I see it also almost as a coping mechanism to get what you need when the dependence has become overwhelming or when the pain has become overwhelming.
I never liked the word addiction. It's really unclear as to what that actually means, and it can and how it lives in somebody, and the meaning seems to be more of a stamp than it is, a process. So really, when I think of addiction, or what I believe people mean by it, I think of compulsivity. And if you think of what compulsivity is, ultimately, it is tension driven by needs. Okay, so speaking to what Claire's saying, basically, most of the people I know who are living good lives are pretty intense people, but they're spreading it out. They exercise, they have good relationships with people, they have meaningful work, they know how to play and enjoy themselves. And so you take that intensity and you spread it out. And that's the opposite of an addiction. That's a creative life. Okay, so the goal for treating addiction, the goal for the end of recovery to be recovered should mean that you're living a life, like Claire said, it should be one in which people are taking all of those needs and all of that energy and moving it, into a balanced life, whatever that might mean for them. And while that sounds simple, that's extremely difficult. But in the end, that's kind of my idea of a treatment. And then what can happen and really can happen, because people are in and out of this state, even people who are really vulnerable are in and out levels of compulsivity all the time. And there's a lot of people who don't feel compulsive at all for years. And so that's a recovered state. That's for sure. And does it help, like Claire's saying, like, I can't go jogging anymore. But I can go hiking and go play tennis and do a whole bunch of things. So I do that. I don't even miss the jogging anymore. So I have to remember that because, I got a bad knee if I do. So you have to be aware, like Claire was suggesting, you have to be aware of the vulnerability. You can't forget about it. But you don't need to live in a compulsive state.
It sounds like you're talking more about getting to a purposeful mindset as opposed to compulsive. At least that's the the word I might use for what you're saying is
But,
energy going in the direction you want it to,
when
not
people are
being driven to it.
I'm sorry.
Oh, just energy going where you would like it to go rather than driven there by compulsion.
Right. I mean, I think what happens is because you have the brain and then you have the personality or the psyche, which operate and affect each other, but which are also separate things. Addiction, because it affects our physiology in the brain. When you're talking about chemicals, it can take a different hold, and the brain tends to remember things. And so there's a process of needing to kind of work out of that, and expand your life. But I don't think you have to live in a compulsive state. That's a painful state for anyone. But you can live in a creative state in which that intensity is being moved in multiple directions.
Well, one of the things I really like
about... I think more than that, too. I'm sorry. I think also because the word addiction, the word, being an addict, has had such a tremendous, negative connotation, and even association at this point, is harmful to people to be tagged as one. Sadly enough, we have used sentences to describe a group of people that have actually hurt them and impaired them from getting full recovery. I think once an addict, always an addict. Addiction is part of your DNA.
Yeah, you find those to be destructive labels.
If addiction is always going to be part of who I am, not of where I've been, why am I trying another path? And so I think those statements are cruel.
I'm going to circle back on something you said, David, when you were talking about being conscious and being purposeful. You mentioned the example of your knee not supporting you jogging anymore, and so you switch over to other things. And the interesting thing about that is I don't know that a lot of people would say that as the first thing comes to their mind if they said relapse prevention or sobriety maintenance. But yet what you're describing probably has a lot more to do with maintaining my sobriety even than talking about my sobriety does.
Ultimately, you've got to recognize the need. With my knee, it's obvious my knee is to exercise, or and so I can't do it that way, so I find other ways to do it, and luckily I can. And I think when people find other ways that are satisfying enough, it really does relieve the need. Once we've had the meal we need and we're no longer hungry, we move on to the next thing.
Correct.
And until that's happening, though, there's a tension. And if you haven't eaten in a long time, you'll begin to become potentially compulsive in some way. And a lot of needs are just unrecognized. And as they're recognized, I think people can move further and further into a state of recovery, or I should say being recovered. They're not going to feel compulsive.
Mm-hmm. And I like when you mention compulsion because that's a measurable behavioral symptom that puts it in a new light when you say it that way. And I think gets away a little bit from the labeling that you're talking about, Claire, escaping from that.
It is. We have to look at the person behind the addiction first and foremost. Has become too basic. This is what everybody needs. One size fits all. It just doesn't work for everyone.
And that's a downside of labeling in general, isn't it?
And it becomes damaging to so many not because the person failed treatment, but the treatment failed the person. But because the person is considered an addict, they put their head down and they believe that's just the course of their, in quotes, disease.
Problem with the word addiction, and I think maybe this is helping me understand it better, the reason I don't like it is health is a fluid state, right? So a healthy individual is somebody who is able to be sad when they're sad, happy when they're happy, angry when they're angry, and know what it is they need, right? And within these states, and know what to do, and have some flexibility in it. But we're fluid, and health is a fluid state. In fact, what depression is a congealing, right? Depression is a congealing of feelings and needs, And the way you treat depression is you go into the depression and you find out what the feelings and needs are and you get them moving again. Because health is a fluid state. And the word addiction is a static state. You're an addict. Okay. And so when people put that on people, it is, as Claire's saying, we're confusing what actually a state of health is as to what a state of being congealed is, like depression. It's not good for us. It's good to understand our vulnerabilities along the way and, assess that well, so that we don't, bite off more than we can handle.
Both of you have referenced if you go enough time without compulsion or without symptoms, that's how you could say, that's how we tell we're recovered or we're in that state of health. Counting time has always been a big part of mentality. Or in the 12-step groups, they count every day. Someone might say, here's how many days I've been sober. Do you have any kind of guidance or issues with how people count their sobriety time? What is helpful?
What are we really counting? Are we counting the days that we have been healthy because we have to hold on so hardly on it because we're so scared we're going to fall tomorrow? It's the same idea of let's all sit in a room and hold each other's hands because we're not strong enough to be out there. I think at one point when we did not understand how our brain works, now we can actually clearly see it in a scan. So people that are depressed can actually take an antidepressant and don't feel that gloom and doom all day long. They can be productive members of society and laugh and have a good life. Also, patients that did use substance, we have medications that can control cravings until chemically they regulate. So there is a neurological regulation due to physiological issues. There's also social issues that causes dysregulations.
It looks like when we talk about then measuring success, you're looking at, once again, more individualized measuring, not just how many days has it been since I've ingested an intoxicant.
Learning tools to deal with anger, dealing with frustration, dealing with sadness. It is very different from one person that had, this supportive family, this intellectual family, this, this strong core growing up, to somebody that both parents were working, got divorced, never had anybody to discuss their fears, their insecurities. So obviously, one is going to recover a lot faster because they have the tools to deal with the craving, to deal with, coming off that negative situation where the other has none. So for them, it's going to be a lot longer process.
So do you feel like there is a place for the 12-step model and the support groups, or do you feel like we've outgrown that in treatment?
I think for support, there's always a space for support. There's always a place for hope. There's always a place for a friend that understands where you are. We can't confuse support with treatment. Mm-hmm. It's that simple.
Yeah, I remember when I worked in a substance abuse clinic, it was primarily most of what we did was court-ordered treatment. And the probation program required people to go to a lot of 12-step meetings. And we had quite a few people who were therapists and counselors that had worked and had gone through 12 steps. And I remember one day my supervisor was talking to everybody and he said, okay, when you're doing group therapy with people, remember, and he writes it on the board and underlines the word therapy. And he said, it's group therapy. We're not having people come in here and pay for medical treatment to have another 12-step group. And he was
Correct.
Very big on drawing a distinction. What is the therapy that I'm coming in and paying for? And then what am I going out and getting support from? And as you put it, friends or sponsors or people who've been there is valuable. but not to confuse that with treatment. I think that's a good
It
concept.
can be for some, Dwight, but it might be harmful for others. We have patients that are constantly telling us that the place that caused them more craving was sitting in meetings. By the time they leave the meetings, that's all they think about.
I think, people do have that experience. Yeah, definitely.
Of course. So if you have not solved, the root issue, if that is misdiagnosed depression, anxiety issue, trauma, whatever led you to use a substance, and you sit in a group talking about the substance that gives you a break from that constant emotional pain, when you leave there, that's what you're going to be thinking of. So that's what I'm saying to you. If the person gets help to, or learn tools or whatever it is that they need to deal with the root issue, whatever form of support they get, that's productive. But you can't forget that the person needs treatment for their individual issue, whatever that is. And that could be a psychiatrist, that could be a physician, that could be a psychotherapist. Everybody's different. There is no set rule, and there shouldn't be, because, again, we're not dealing with the addiction. We're dealing with an individual human being that is complex, that has a different makeup, that has a different history.
And sometimes people coming into treatment aren't used to being treated individually. I mean, you've talked about, just in general, how they can be viewed as like you're one big group and all of you are like this. I think that's even more so when people are coming into treatment because of either a legal problem or some other form of rock bottom. I'm getting dumped by my spouse, or I'm getting threatened with jail time. I think that's even more demoralizing and dehumanizing, and that can kind of amplify the effect you're talking about.
Yeah, and we were talking about, me and David yesterday, about this. I see a lot of people that have never really dealt with their feelings, although they have a tremendous amount of emotions. They have not learned the tools to deal with their own feelings. They grew up learning how to respond to other people, but not to theirs. So they are overwhelmed with emotions that they have no tools to work with them.
As time goes by, do you see that there correlates or tends to be a correlation with time away from use and likelihood of relapse going down?
Just spoke to somebody that got treated 15 years ago that just called me out of the blue. I'm going to let David answer that question.
I think that the more time you have away from any habit, the more you're probably developing other habits and other ways of coping and dealing with life. And if you've been doing it like this individual for 15 years, you've developed a lot of different ways. It doesn't mean that you can't at some point become compulsive again. Compulsivity is a part of life, not just for people who deal with substance abuse, but for everybody. Okay, it's a normal part of life because people feel stuck and trapped. Whatever their coping mechanisms are in those times, good or bad, they tend to go back to. But the more time you have, the more you almost necessarily develop other ways of managing. A lot of things are going to happen in 15 years. So it's a good sign. And it also depends on how people relapse. Sometimes people relapse in a very short way in which they kind of stumble and then, get a hold of themselves and get out of it really quickly. And their lives doesn't go downhill for a long time. And so you'll see a lot more of that with people who've had long periods of sobriety.
Right. And I think it's good you're pointing out that all relapses are not equal. Relapse is different depending on degree of relapse. And I think that's important. One of the things that I see sometimes as a downside when people get really, really into counting day by day by day is there's a tendency to think, oh, wow, I've been sober for, 9,000 days, and then I had a drink, and now I've flushed all that down the toilet. And I think to your point, you're talking about how I have learned things. That's all still there. Those lessons are still pertinent, even if I have a relapse or some other setback.
That's right. One of the reasons I think that this is that I'll use the word, even though I don't like it, that addiction isn't talked well about or in-depthly about, is because it's complex. I know people who have tremendous capacities to put the brakes on, and other people who really, really struggle. There's so many variables that come into play. I think, to what Claire said, I really agree. I think AA helps a lot of people and has been really helpful to a lot of people, and it's an immense support system. It's not a treatment because there's no attunement at the level that would potentially help somebody work out. When AA works well, what you find is there is better and better attunement. So if you go to a meeting and there's people there who know you and like you and you can talk to, you start to get that, attunement ultimately is the therapeutic tool. I mean, it's at the core of psychology, and I think it's the core of any successful treatment. Is there's a real sense of somebody who knows you and is attuned to you in a way that is good for you. That can happen in different spaces at different levels.
Yeah, and you don't look for certain kinds of friendship from your doctor, just like you shouldn't look for certain kind of medical advice from your friends.
Well, that's it. And so there's benefits and limits to everything.
To any relationship. If there's one sentence that comes to mind, is we need to allow people the opportunity to recover.
I agree. And we should listen to where people are at. And when they say they're done with something, we should give them the opportunity to be done with it and to move forward in their lives.
And we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, David. Thank you, all of you, for listening as well. We're going to be back at you again in a couple weeks when our topic is going to be what a treatment actually is. We have some insights to really build upon the conversation we started today of some of that terminology around what is treatment. If you have questions, either along those lines or other topics you'd like us to address, please email those questions to us at info@opiates.com, or you can hit us up at opiates on Twitter. So until we're there with you next time, remember to keep asking questions, because whenever you have questions, you get answers, and when you get answers, you get hope. For Claire Waismann and David Livingston, I've been Dwight Hurst. Thanks again for being here. The Waismann Method podcast is a production of the Waismann Method, offering medical detox and individualized treatment options for opioid dependence. Go to opiates.com to learn more. Our music is the song Medical by Clean Mind Sounds. The show is produced by Pop Collar Productions, a company where we find interesting and exciting solutions to your business goals through podcasts. Find out more about us at popcollar.net.